So what I would say before we become too euphoric, or I would remind fellow Americans who voted for Trump as I did and who are being very euphoric that yes, these are good news and these are good times, but they're also part of the natural pendulum that swings back and forth in the sense that young people, yes, are now being rebellious by being conservative. A time will come when they're being rebellious by being progressive or left-wing again. So we can't, we have to take a broader look as well.
I'm Aaron Flam, and you're listening to or watching Deconstructive Criticism. Joining me once again is the brilliant philosopher Dr. Benedict Beckeld, whose profound insights have enriched our understanding of history, culture, and philosophy. Born in Uppsala, Sweden, and raised in Stockholm and New York City, Dr. Beckeld's academic journey has taken him through Germany, France, and Italy, culminating in a PhD in philosophy, Greek, and Latin. He has taught at esteemed institutions like the University of Heidelberg and the American University of Paris, and now focuses on writing and exploring critical topics such as aesthetics, political philosophy, and the philosophy of history. Dr. Beckeld is also the author of Western Self-Contempt, Oikophobia in the Decline of Civilizations, which we explored in depth in our previous 2 conversations. Today, we're taking a new direction, discussing the concept of hope in the West, its roots, its implications, and its relevance in shaping our present and future. Please join us as we discuss the US and Europe's chances of turning the tide of our falling civilizations. Enjoy. Welcome back to Deconstructive Criticism, Mr. Benedict Beckeld. Or it's professor, actually. Professor.
Technically, it's neither nor. It used to be professor, but I don't have a university appointment right now. So it's in the American cultural space, it would just be Dr. Benedict Beckeld.
All right. So not Mr. either.
No, both.
He PhD type situation.
Exactly, that's right. Yeah. So I haven't been a professor for 10 years.
Happy New Year to you, by the way.
Happy New Year. It's going to be an amazing 2025. I can feel it.
I can imagine. If you're in America, it must feel rather special.
Yes, exactly. We're very happy. I still have my pen with which I voted for Donald Trump, so this is my lucky pen now. Everything I write with it is bound to be successful.
You think so?
I hope so. Well, we'll see. I have a good feeling.
Well, there will be a lot to do, and I don't think victory alone is enough, right? There's a lot of things that he needs to do or actually get done.
Exactly.
I mean, because he got elected and we didn't really have snow this Christmas here in Sweden.
Oh, really? Oh.
Yes, which of course must be Trump's fault somehow.
Right. We actually did have some snow. This was actually the first white Christmas we've had in New York City in quite a while, I think so. It was unusual. Yeah.
And so, he hasn't even been sworn in yet.
I know. We're getting nice signs from above, yeah.
Yes, and last time I spoke to you, you were single.
Yes.
But now that he's elected, I bet you're married and have 2 children, both grown up, valedictorian, attending Ivy League schools.
That's right, exactly. Oh, Ivy League, horrible. Perish the thought. Yeah. But yes. We'll see. We'll hopefully move in that direction.
Well, you're actually going to be the first episode of Deconstructive Criticism in 2025, Benedict.
That's an honor, thank you.
Yes, it's a treat for us here in the, what would you call it? Editor's room, which consists of only me as well. And the reason is that we actually got a sort of a joined tweet from a previous listener who wanted us to have a conversation about specifically, I think, Europe.
I think she mentioned both Europe and America, but yes, certainly Europe as well. That's more her own concern. She's Swedish herself, I believe, so yeah.
Yes, but maybe we should start in America. She wrote to us that she wanted us to have a discussion about America and also Europe, because she sees a right-wing wave sweeping across Europe in the coming years, which I interpreted as a positive thing from her perspective. And she wanted us to have a discussion about that. But so let's start with the US. It's... when we record this, it's 19 or 18 days until he ascends the throne.
Yes. Yeah, I think she had mentioned that our last two discussions she found very interesting, but they were also a bit depressing. So now that we maybe have some good news or maybe some causes for optimism to add to that as well. So here in the United States, and yes, I will say, I guess we'll then move on to Europe afterwards. When it comes to the two continents, I am more optimistic about the United States, as usual, than I am about Europe, although there are some positive signs in Europe as well, depending a little bit where one is, but by and large, at least better than a year ago. But so here in the United States, my initial thought would be that, yes, signs are very good, and there seems to be a bit of a, I don't want to read too much into it, but a bit of a cultural shift toward conservatism. It's easy to overread that. I hear some people celebrating now that, wokeism is dead and left-wing radicalism is dead and okophobia is dead and so on. Well, no, they're not dead. They're going to continue to fight very clearly. But one positive thing I think one can say is that it has become cool again among younger people to be conservative. And that is significant, of course, because they are future voters or now just voting for the first time. And that's significant. It's also because it's a sign of the fact, it's a sign of the degree to which the left had established a cultural hegemony, because young people want to be rebellious in general. That's part of what it means to be young in many cases. And the fact that now it appears to be rebellious to be conservative is, of course, a sign, is a proof of the degree to which the left had conquered almost everything, culturally speaking anyway. And so because of that, there is a natural backlash. So what I would say before we become too euphoric, or I would remind fellow Americans who voted for Trump as I did and who are being very euphoric that, yes, these are good news and these are good times, but they're also part of the natural pendulum that swings back and forth in the sense that young people, yes, are now being rebellious by being conservative. A time will come when they're being rebellious by being progressive or left-wing again. So we can't, we have to take a broader look as well. But having said that, yes, there are good things happening. And so far, anyway, based on what I've seen of what he intends to do, I think the new federal government is going to be doing a lot of good things.
I think maybe the reason why talking to you about things like this being so depressing is that you have this cyclical theory of history. Yeah. I've actually, the American election for me, sort of in a way, and I'm not overstating this, reaffirmed my faith in humanity.
No, okay, right. I see. Yeah,
because that meant, in a sense, that there is a populace somewhere where a majority of people can see through an enormous amount of lies and propaganda, and still express a wish to do the right thing. Mm-hmm. And it's left me with an uneasy feeling ever since. Also, Israel's winning on every front has made me very happy, but also left me with an uneasy feeling. And I don't know if it's because the hubris coming from the supporters of two of my favorite teams here in the world, or if I'm just so unused to winning that it feels strange to me. Yeah,
no, I think that's true, actually, that we have been so used to defeat after defeat, that which leads into this euphoria, that we've almost forgotten what it's like to be winning. And so for that reason also, I think one sometimes reads too much into it. Now, I don't want to be you seem like you're the sort of now the optimistic American, and I'm sort of the depressed Swede. So maybe we're switching roles here because
don't worry. Like the third of my favorite teams, Sweden, in which I live and I'm a citizen of, still seems to be losing on every front. So here I'm on familiar territory and feel very safe.
Right, exactly. Yeah. too much success all at one time.
There's still explosions here every week. The shootings have gone down some. But we've only managed to actually expel 666 illegal citizens out of maybe 80,000. So that's like 0.8%. Mm-hmm. We're failing miserably, and I'm so used to it. So it feels like a safe room. That's
a relief. Yeah, exactly. We don't get to feel too discombobulated by too much success.
No, but what I wanted to ask you about America and American youth is, in my view, the leftist or progressive hegemony which have ruled and now obviously lost in the United States, which is significant considering what country you actually are in the world. Do you think this will mean a deeper cultural shift? And since I'm talking to you as a philosopher, I wanted to know specifically, do you think this will mean that the culture will shift from consequentialism to a more deontological sort of moral framework?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. I remember we touched a little bit upon that in our last conversation. I don't think we, I recall you mentioned consequentialism. I don't think we got that deep into it. But I do to some extent, yes. Although I wouldn't necessarily decouple the two so much. I mean, some of this, if you want to call it a deontological wave that's coming now, is based also to a certain extent in a consequentialist way of looking at things, because people see what the results are, what the consequences quite literally are of left-wing policy. But having said that, yes, there is also a deontological element to it, where young people now are, some young people are now saying, well, this is not the proper way to behave. This is the proper way to behave. This is what one should do, and so on. And that is deontology. Excuse me. So I think there is definitely truth to that. I do think, I'm not saying, when I say that it's a pendulum, I'm not saying that things are going to go back, now more on the positive side, I'm not saying that things are going to go back again in the next electoral cycle or whatever to how they were before. No, I do think this is a part of a cultural shift to some degree. All I'm saying is that one shouldn't overread it too much, and one shouldn't become complacent. I think there's a great risk of complacency whenever there has been a great victory. But so there is a cultural shift, and what is significant, and maybe that will also lead us then to Europe, is that for good and bad, Europe, as you know, takes after the United States in many cultural respects. And if the Americans have shown the way on something, very often it then becomes less taboo in some parts, at least, of Europe as well. And so it will be a snowballing effect, I think. And that, like Milei in Argentina, is a part of that as well. I mean, he's actually before now this victory in the United States. So I do think we are talking about a snowballing effect. And so I do think it is a part of a cultural shift. And I think that in the years to come, regardless of what happens in future elections, let's say the Republicans lose in 2028, hopefully not. If Trump will be very successful, that will then lead to continued Republican rule. But if that happens, it won't go back, in the sense that once the spell of wokeism has been broken, once the spell of transgenderism has been broken, it's very hard to reconstitute it again. And so the left will certainly continue the fight, but the left will continue the fight from a slightly shifted frontier, if that makes sense. Now that people are finally kind of waking up and looking around and saying, did we really agree to chopping off healthy body parts of teenage girls or teenage boys? Was this actually something that society thought was okay? Once that spell has been broken, it's very hard. It's going to be very hard, I think, for that to come back. And so in that sense, yes, even though the struggle between conservatism and progressivism will continue, it will continue from a more advanced frontier from the conservative point of view. So I think that certainly is cause for optimism, yeah.
Yeah, when you say chopping off body parts of young people, that gives us a very nice way to shift our interest to Great Britain, right. Because they came out with the Cass report, which laid the foundation for the ruling in the US Supreme Court, I suppose.
Yeah, I think it was related, yeah.
But also, as we speak, there seems to be more revelations from the Rotherham grooming gangs.
Right. This is a great example. Exactly. I've been looking at this. I mean, this has been, as you know, doing the rounds on X now for the last couple of weeks, I guess. And this is another example. Again, people, this kind of wake-up feeling of saying that, well, is this something that actually was allowed? And that's becoming okay to say. It's not so much, and well, it's in addition to the fact that people are waking up to this. It's not only, there were a lot of people before as well who would have said that, okay, what happened in Great Britain with the grooming scandal is awful, and what we're doing to young people with transgender surgery is awful. But now there is this And that's really what we mean by cultural shift. The cultural shift is something that happens at the grassroots level, not something that happens on top. And now in the office, people, when they're going to the water cooler or they're going to the coffee machine on a work break or something, they're actually not afraid to talk about this anymore to their work colleagues the way they were before. And that is really what a cultural shift means. Like it's
yeah, and also it seems like people are starting to connect the dots, that multiculturalism led to grooming gangs.
Exactly.
And transgender ideology to mutilation of children. Mm-hmm. And they can see, as you said, or actually as I think I wrote in my book, the consequences of consequentialism.
The consequences, yes. Exactly. No, exactly. And people see that, okay, well, this is actually, this all hangs together, as you say. I mean, there is this concept, which you probably know, called the monocause, right? Where they say that left-wingers kind of see one cause for everything, which is oppression and so on, and that then leads to all of these absurd policies. And once the right itself recognizes that that's how the left views things, then it becomes easier to see how all of those things hang together. That doesn't mean that we want to simplify the world the way the left simplifies the world by viewing everything as just a question of oppressor versus oppressed. But once we understand that that's how the left is simplifying the world, it then becomes easier for the right to combat that, because we, as you say, we understand how these things all hang together. And so that one can come out against transgender surgery for minors at the same time as one criticizes the tolerance of groomers and so on in Great Britain. And one sees that these are in fact not isolated issues, but that they all are part of the larger cause of defending traditional Western values and of not letting our culture slide into complete decadence.
I do wish people would stop saying things like progressivism and leftism and just call it socialism. Yeah, right. So much easier and clearer and to the point.
I certainly agree. I mean, socialism är ondska is something I should have a coffee cup like that as well. Actually, next time
I will send you one. I've actually gotten in a new batch, so I'll send you one.
Oh, that's nice.
And hope that it holds up in shipping. It is a ceramic piece, after all. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I'll make sure to use it, on camera and on various occasions. But it's true. I mean, you're absolutely right that everyone who defends these things, not everyone, but most people who defend these things, they do tend to be socialists. The only reason I'm not applying that label to everything is because even though you could say that a socialistic ethos is related to it, because socialism indeed is a lot about oppressed versus oppressor and so on, socialism itself is not, I mean, like the socialistic policies themselves are not represented in all of these cases. But you're certainly right that there is...
But they are utilitarian.
Yeah, they're utilitarian, but I wouldn't say...
And so consequentialist.
Yeah, but one could make... That's true, but one could make consequentialist and utilitarian arguments for non-socialistic policies as well. That doesn't mean necessarily...
Oh, absolutely.
Right. One wouldn't necessarily be right in doing so, but it could be done. So that's
what's so interesting, what you said earlier about the American youth's return to conservatism, and I asked if they're returning to deontology on a deeper level, and you sort of you didn't say it outright, but I got a feeling that you meant that it was almost a pragmatic deontology.
Yes, if that's not a contradiction in terms. I mean,
it would be, but right. I mean, I'm speaking to a philosopher, so you're supposed to be able to resolve such things.
Yeah, so right. Well, Kant wasn't able to. Then again, I don't think highly of Kant. So if you take a very Kantian view of it, you would say that, well, actually, they are very different. Because I mean, there is a passage where Kant sings the praise of duty, plikt, right, plikt in Swedish, and he talks about, and he actually even makes a specific point that duty is so important that even if it's not pragmatic, even if it leads to some ridiculous circumstances in the short term, nonetheless, duty is what should prevail. So he divorces those very strongly, deontology and consequentialism. But I think that one doesn't have to take a Kantian view of that. I think one can say that deontology is its own consequentialism in and of itself, which I guess is I don't know if that's what you were implying, but I think one could certainly make that point. Personally, I tend not to get too stuck in those labels, I suppose, because I'm not always sure how helpful they are. By and large, I mean, as you could probably imagine, I myself tend toward a more deontological view, but I think it's sometimes a little bit of a false dichotomy. In the sense that, okay, well, consequentialism and utilitarianism, it's really just a question of how far you measure the consequences of something. So if you say, okay, if we're taking a utilitarian approach, the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people, as it's classically phrased, well, what does that even mean? And how long does that greatest happiness last? And what comes at the end of that greatest happiness? And could it even be that that greatest happiness then leads to unhappiness after the end of the happiness, right? And so that's why I find the whole consequentialist, and I suppose, I mean, that's also why you're criticizing consequentialism, but I find the whole consequentialist ethos a bit short-sighted, if you will. Then but again,
it has been hegemonic for decades.
It has.
And I think it's part of our general malaise here in the West.
Yeah, but I think maybe you're also putting consequentialism and hedonism very close to each other. And I would say that that's maybe sometimes a bit unfair to the consequentialists, because again, what does happiness mean? Okay, so some people would say, well, happiness means pleasure and so on, and that's where then we get into hedonism. There are at least some consequentialists who would argue that, well, no, we do take a somewhat broader view of things, and when we talk about consequentialism, we mean things down the line. And they would reject hedonism out of consequentialist grounds and say that, well, hedonism leads to bad results. And so all I'm saying is that sometimes deontology and consequentialism aren't as strictly separated as they appear to be. It really depends on the case, and it depends on how one interprets them. I mean, not to introduce more complexity than is necessary into the question, but
why not? I mean, the reason I bring this up with you, I want to have this discussion with someone who has actually read and teaches philosophy, is that it's a discussion I think the West should have. There should be one of these discussions in every country where we discuss the benefits of consequentialism. And then, of course, we can discuss the benefits or, opposites of benefits would be what?
The benefits of what? Of deontology?
Well, there are benefits and obviously there are bad sides, right, of deontology. Yeah. So I'm looking for the opposite word of benefits.
Negative aspects.
Yes, and I'm sure there are those as well. But if you can identify something that has been generally applied and failed so miserably, well, maybe you should discuss that thing, and then the alternative.
Right. Yeah, no, certainly. And and as I mentioned, I mean, I tend to, but one could say about deontology, for example, or about a deontological approach, that, okay, if everyone has a deontological mindset, that could also lead to, that could have some negative consequences, such as, for example, it might lead to a reduction in innovation, creativity, things like that, depending on how far one takes the deontological mindset. And so I would say that, as so often, a healthy society, certainly a healthy Western society like the United States, would find a way of being, if you will, that combines a little bit of both approaches, even though I would certainly err on the side of deontology. But I think that if one divides things up so strictly, we are either deontologists or we are consequentialists. In either case, I think one would sell oneself a bit short, is what I'm saying. And so that's why I'm saying we're making it a little more complex, because I think one can extract positive things from both those approaches, even if one emphasizes the deontological aspect more than the consequentialist one. If that makes sense.
In a sense, I think I want to know if this cultural shift will lead to me having to wear armor and sing ballads beneath balconies of ladies. You understand? Yes.
Yeah, I don't think so. No, because again, yes, it is a cultural shift, but again, it's still 2024, 2025 actually. Sorry. And now I actually hate when people say that. Usually, like, oh, in the year 2025, can you believe this happens in 2025? because, well, why wouldn't it happen? Human beings will be human beings. But my point is that things are still progressed in a negative way up to a point where I think that's going to be very hard to recapture. I mean, it's not that we're turning the clock back here. It's that we're taking a slightly different path forward. But that means that there are still certain things that we will continue to carry with us, culturally speaking. And so even though we take a slightly different step forward, it's not atavistic what's happening now. And this is actually, I think, a good response to the left-wing critique as well. You know, when leftists say, "Oh, you want to take the world back to 1950 or something," or maybe in your case to the year, or with your example to the year 1300. The answer to that is, well, no, we're not taking the world back anywhere. In some respects, actually, I think it would be good if we actually turned back the clock. But I don't think that's what's happening. What's happening is simply that we're continuing to progress, but in a slightly different way, and with more caution, and having peeled away some of the worst excesses of the progressive left. But there are still certain things that are not going to come back. I don't think so.
I'm really curious to see what they're going to call DEI next.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, as you say, exactly. They're going to repackage things and so on. I mean, it's about marketing, and as I said in the beginning, they will continue the fight again from a more advanced frontier, from our point of view. But yeah, those things will continue. And the woman, if it was a woman that wrote to us on Twitter, she has a certain point, though. I checked the betting odds for Reform UK, and Nigel Farage is fated to be the next prime minister of the UK, if you're to believe the betting odds. And then, of course, I come now with my Swedish depressiveness and point out that Nigel Farage, a couple of months ago, basically seemed to have made peace with the fact that there is a massive Islamic population in the UK, and that's something that has to be accepted. And so hopefully maybe he was just had a weak moment there, or a bit of a slip of the tongue. I guess if he does become prime minister at some point, I guess we'll find out. But there seems to be, that is a question of restarting the battle at a more regressed frontier from our point of view in the UK, if we're now switching over to closer to your home. Namely the fact that, yes, okay, it's good that that the Brits then will have somebody who is a bit more realistic, if you will, or not so progressive as the current leadership. But again, if the attitude is that there is a large minority, large Islamic minority in England, and that English people will have to make peace with that, well, that's not good enough. And I have written pretty extensively on why that's not good enough.
Why?
And, yeah. Well, because Islam simply is not compatible with Western forms of government. It is not. And there are no two ways about that. We have to say that very uncompromisingly. Obviously, it doesn't mean every single Muslim thinks in this way. There are some individual Muslims, of course, who do wish to adapt to a Western lifestyle and to Western forms of government. But Islam, by and large, is absolutely anti-Western. And it's important to point out that this is not a small fringe of Islam, some small minority of fanatics that are anti-Western. No, Islam itself, mainstream Islam, not an extremist form of Islam, just mainstream Islam is anti-Western. And Europe, now we don't have the same problem in the United States. We do have to some extent. I mean, just the other day, there were, pro-Hamas protests on 6th Avenue here in my own city.
Well, just today, as we speak, I think there was a terrorist attack in St. Louis?
In New Orleans, yeah.
New Orleans, yes.
Yeah, I believe it was yesterday, yeah. Yeah, exactly, which was clearly an Islamic attack, exactly. So we certainly have the problem here as well, but we don't have the same, from a demographic point of view, we don't have the same problem. The problem we have with it is more isolated terror attacks, which are very serious, of course, but it's not so much a demographic problem, whereas what Europe has, of course, including the United Kingdom, is a serious demographic problem, because the percentage, the Islamic percentage of the population is simply so much greater. And this is another reason, by the way, that we should, when these things happen, we should not use the word Islamist. We should use the word Muslim or Islamic, because Islamist is a left-wing word. It suggests that the word Islamist tries to divorce Islam from extremism, saying, well, this wasn't a Muslim, it was an Islamist. But if you're actually acquainted with Islamic philosophy, you realize that, well, actually, no, this is Islam, it's not Islamism. And in fact, it's only, again, something I've written about, it's only since about the word Islamism itself has existed for a few hundred years, but it used to be used synonymously with Islam. It's only since about the 1960s that it has started to be used as something separate from Islam. So that if a Muslim does something horrible, we can then say, well, it wasn't a Muslim, it was an Islamist. And this is not the case. So conservatives, I mean, anyone really, but certainly conservatives, if they want to understand the nature of the problem, they also have to understand how the problem begins or is a part of the language as well, and they have to stop using the word Islamist or Islamism, because again, these are left-wing words meant to protect Islam. If a Jew does something horrible, it practically never happens. But if once in a blue moon something like that happens, nobody says, well, he's a Jewishist or something. No, he's Jewish, right? But although it would actually make more sense to do so, because if you look at the philosophies of the various religions, as I do quite extensively, then you see that, well, actually what many of... there are different schools of Islam, so I'm not going to say, there's no one Islam. So there are certainly Muslims who would disagree, but you would see that this kind of behavior is much closer to Islamic philosophy than it is to Jewish philosophy, certainly to Christian philosophy. And so this is one reason why somebody, in order for the tide to turn in the United Kingdom and in many other European countries, people have to realize this as well. They mustn't just come out against left-wing progressivism, although that's certainly part of it. They must also come out against Islam. Not to say that there cannot be a single Muslim in Europe. Of course, we have all kinds of people living everywhere, all over the world. But it does mean that they have to understand that the Islamic minority must remain a small minority, because otherwise Western governments and cultures will not continue.
Speaking of large Muslim populations, let's move to Germany. They're having a snap election in February, and you've lived there, so you still have friends there, I suppose?
Yes, absolutely.
And are they into politics, or have they become nihilists by now?
No, my best friend in Germany actually works for the German federal government in Berlin. So, yeah, I have many good friends there. I have more friends in Germany than in Sweden, actually, because since I lived there more recently and as an adult, as opposed to just being a small child in Sweden. Well, so it's interesting when you say nice. So actually, one of them, this is actually also my best friend who works in the government, he even says it's too late for Germany. And I even tell, he has 3 children, and I tell him, I mean, you have 3 children, don't you feel that you have to do something for this, for the sake of the next generation, your own children? They're about 7, 8, 9 years old. And he said, I mean, sure, yeah, I would like to, but he says that it's too late. It's the point of no return has been passed.
I mean, they don't. I mean, their Muslim population is not that large, so why is it too late?
Well, but he feels, and to be honest, I'm inclined to agree with him, but again, I hope it's incorrect, that it's large enough, and of course they also reproduce at a greater rate than the native German population, that basically the tide can't be stopped, and also because they're much more vociferous and because they believe much more strongly what they believe than native Germans do. And this is something I actually talked about a little bit in Western Self-Contempt, which we talked about last time in the book, that if you have 10 Western relativists and 1 or maybe 2 absolutist Muslims, they will be as strong or stronger than the much larger group of relativists, because the relativists, the Western relativists, the moral and cultural relativists, they don't really believe in anything anymore. And so they will simply not stand up and fight as hard for what they believe as the Muslims who are absolutists. They genuinely believe in their own truths as severely and as hardly as they will. And we can see this. And they're also more ready to use violence, many of them, than Westerners are, and intimidation. And I mean, one can see this. Who is afraid publicly in a typical North or Western European country to say publicly what they believe? A Westerner or a Muslim? Well, the answer is clear. The Muslim is less afraid to say publicly what he believes than the Westerner, even though the Westerner still is clearly in the majority. Well, why is that? Well, it's for 2 reasons. It's because, number 1, the Westerner is less willing to use violence than the Muslim is, and number 2, because the Westerner doesn't believe in the first place as strongly in what he might say publicly as the Muslim believes in what he would say publicly.
We can talk about castration of male culture as well, but we're not in, I don't think we should move to Sweden quite yet. But I mean, if I look at the projection in Germany, AfD is set to be second largest party.
Yeah. So I think my guess would be that the Germans aren't quite there yet. So even if the AfD were to become actually the largest party or very close to it, it seems, at least based on recent statements from Merz, it seems that there is still the attitude that they will work hard, the mainstream parties will work hard to keep the AfD out of government, even if the German people show that they prefer the AfD by and large. And that being the case, I think it would still be difficult for Weidel to become chancellor. We'll see. Maybe that's wrong. For a while, I was thinking that maybe now the attack in Magdeburg at the Christmas market would help the AfD. It doesn't look, based on polls right now, that that's really the case, because they were able to. Somehow there were some questions about what the attacker's actual motives were and so on, and that maybe he was actually an AfD supporter and not a Muslim. As the case may be, it seems like it hasn't shifted German opinion strongly enough. So my guess is that the mainstream parties will continue to be able to cobble together a coalition now in the next election. I hope that's incorrect, and I hope the AfD will prove victorious. But things might have to get even worse in Germany before they wake up. I guess we'll see.
Yes, and then I doubt it will get better. Being an avid fan of German history.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
So what was it more? She mentioned Poland. I know, Poland is basically largest GDP growth in the EU at the moment and largest expenditure on military.
Yeah.
In NATO, I think 3.9%.
Is it largest in NATO? Okay, that's good.
I think so.
I mean, they have their own. Yeah, I didn't look up the latest figures, but that sounds. They have a reason. Of course, we can thank Russia for that.
3.9%.
3.9. Okay. Yeah, I mean, Eastern Europe, by and large, of course, is much healthier and should really be a model to some extent. Now, of course, they voted in Poland. They seem to backtrack a little bit and move more to the left again. But again, politics is one thing, and cultural shifts, if you will, are another. And there's still certainly a major.
I have a slight idea about. I think a friend of mine who spent a lot of time in Poland says that, the Poles might move left from their conservatism, but they're not going socialist in that case. When they say liberal, they mean something completely different than what the Americans mean, and what the Swedes mean by. Also, in Sweden, liberal is generally a negative word that the left uses against the right, and not the other way around. So
it's similar in Germany as well. Yeah, I remember telling a German friend what liberal means in America, and he was dumbfounded. The exact opposite. But this is part of the point that even though there is culturally, they're still much healthier than we are, even though they voted for, from their perspective, a more left-wing government. And of course, that's partly because they can see what's going on in the West, in the western part of Europe, and partly also because of Russia. And Russia, of course, for them, from their point of view, historically, is the big boogeyman, for good reason, certainly from the Polish point of view. And that is helpful. So in that regard, Putin is doing the West a favor, because he's at least helping the if unwittingly or inadvertently, he's helping the East Europeans remember what's what and what's important. And that, I mean, you've seen that a little bit further west as well. I mean, even in Sweden, once the war started in Ukraine, you'll know this better than I do, but I had the impression, at least, that even in Sweden, there was some people in Sweden kind of started to wake up to the importance of national defense. And when that happened, obsession with climate politics, for example, Greta Thunberg and all of these things became a little less important, because suddenly people remembered that, actually, there are genuinely important things that are going on in the world.
Greta went full pro-Palestine.
Yes, exactly. Right.
For climate reasons. apparently.
Exactly, yeah.
Yes.
The monocause, again, as we mentioned before. Which of course shows how disingenuous it all is, because it's only a question of crushing what is perceived to be the power, if you will, and has so little to do with a particular cause that she or that her acolytes are devoting themselves to. But so in that regard, that is when history knocks on the door and reminds people that the world is still a dangerous place. That, of course, does have a culturally salutary effect.
Yeah, but it's interesting that any eventual hope might come from the East.
Yeah, right.
I mean, if you want to look to a glimmer of hope in the East, said no one ever. Until now, apparently.
Right.
The Poles really have reasons to fear the Russians. And so do we Swedes, actually.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I get a sense that the Poles are sort of, what would you Americans say? They're almost itching for a fight with Russia because they have old cheese to give back.
Well,
which is a Swedish expression that I translated directly, and it doesn't really work. But
right. I must have forgotten that expression in Swedish too.
Yes,
but
to pay back for old cheese.
Right, pay back for old cheese. Oh yes, of course, it's coming. I have these moments sometimes where I hear a Swedish word. The other day, I heard the word "baddare," and I suddenly remembered, oh, that's a word I had forgotten completely, and then it comes back to me with all these childhood memories. But anyway, ge tillbaks för gammal ost, right? Isn't it? Something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah, I'd completely forgotten that, but I remember it now. Thank you. We should do this more often. I'll relearn Swedish.
I actually realized something just the other day that I've never thought of. My wife made me aware of it. It's in English, you say when you part ways, you say take care of yourself.
Right. Yeah.
But if you directly translate what Swedes say to each other, it's be afraid for yourself. Be very afraid for yourself.
Yeah, right. Oh, yeah, var rädd om dig. Well, right, yes. That's right. That's funny. That's, Swedish ethos right there. Yeah, that's interesting. Yes. Yeah, I have to also come back more often, read more literature.
Well, they used to have balls, the Swedes.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Speaking of Russia, I mean, we remember Narva and all of these things. Yeah, they were the most feared army in the world.
Yes.
For a while there. Even took Prague. It's hard to believe today. That's far afield. But I think
Prague is the better for it, I might add, because they got Swedish architecture, which really has contributed to the city's beauty. Yeah,
I should have paid more attention to that last time I was there. But Stockholm is gorgeous. I love the architecture in Stockholm. But yeah. So let's see. What were we saying now?
So there was you saw some glimmers of hope in Poland, none in Germany. You don't think AfD will win? The German people
I think there might be glimmers. I think there might be glimmers of hope coming, but I just don't think they're there quite yet. I think we might have to wait a little longer for that to be the case. We'll see, but that's my impression.
And also, what can they do once they get in power? I mean, because Nigel Farage, when he says, well, I think we're just going to have to accept that we have a large population that doesn't like the rest of us very much, and that we don't like, and that's the way it's going to be, because we're not prepared, even if we get power, to do what's necessary.
Yeah, no, that's not going to be enough. I mean, there has to be repatriation, or a less polite word, expulsion. Really, again, not of everyone, but there has to be a much more aggressive, and even in many cases, disenfranchisement, which is radical, but that has to happen.
What would that mean exactly for my Swedish listeners?
Meaning that they lose the vote and they lose their citizenship. They have to be stripped of citizenship. Many of them that are citizens, and to disenfranchise means to take away the right to vote. That has to happen, because even if you were to to turn off the spigot of continued Islamic immigration and say, okay, no more, the population that is already there is large enough that the problem will continue. So first of all, I don't think none of them, including Farage, hasn't really indicated that they will stop immigration from the Islamic world and turn it to zero. So that's an additional problem. But even if they do, again, that's not enough. So there has to be a lot of courage in dealing with this and in making sure that that there is actually forced, either voluntary, and if not voluntary, then forced repatriation. And I mean, this is what Trump wants to do now. Of course, not related to an Islamic problem. He wants to repatriate people to Mexico and other Latin American countries.
But I can see you Americans doing that. I have a really hard time seeing a European country doing that.
Yeah, so
maybe
that's why
Germany, but as you say, it's too far off. Sweden, if we are to turn to what is, according to measurements, the most feminine country in the world. That's where I live. I see absolutely no chance of that happening. I think Malmö, our southernmost town, are two communal elections, that's local elections, away from Muslim majority. Mm-hmm. And that's the third largest city in Sweden.
Right.
And they have positive growth. I don't understand why there's a thumbs up suddenly in the picture, but
Apple does this. If you make a hand gesture where the thumb appears to be pointing upwards, I've had this problem myself.
Okay, it completely threw me off. But Malmö and Gothenburg has a positive growth when it comes to demography, but it's mostly Muslims, or I think almost exclusively Muslims. And Stockholm, the largest city, the capital of Sweden, where I live, we have negative growth. So this is not a country that sees any glimmer of hope in the future, and something that really sort of, I think, provides a generous example for eventual people from outside of Sweden who might be listening to this. We're having a court case in Sweden now where 4 Muslims are being prosecuted for attempted terrorism, where they, for ISIS or Al Qaeda or something, were supposed to do a terror attack, primarily against Jewish targets. And 2 of the people being prosecuted are young Swedes, ethnic Swedes that have been converted to Islam. So, and I think this is an example that illustrates where we're heading as a country.
Yeah. And this is, and that's also because when those kinds of things happen, for example, the fellow who did the terror attack now in New Orleans was apparently an American citizen. He was born in Texas, I believe, although he was of
military service.
Military service,
well.
exactly, and then was, but is of Muslim extraction and was recruited by ISIS or something like that. And so then the left, of course, come and say, well, you see, it was an American who did this, or in the case, in the Swedish case that you just described, well, you see, there were 2 Swedish people who did this, so it's not just the Muslims. It's evil comes in all forms, and of course, all human beings. I mean, every people, every nation is capable of performing great evil acts. But the point in the Swedish case is, of course, that yes, once is that their goal is to turn Sweden and the whole world Muslim. That is, of course, and this is why, as I said before, Islam is anti-Western, because it combines 2 things. And again, it's something I've written extensively about. Islam combines 2 things that of which Christianity and Judaism only has one. It combines proselytism with a political construct. Now, Judaism has, to some degree, the political construct, but it doesn't have proselytism. Christianity, again, by and large, one can get into greater details, but by and large, Christianity does have proselytism, but not the political construct. Whereas Islam has both the proselytism and the political construct, which means that it is the goal of Islam not just to gain more believers. Sure, Christians also want to gain more believers, but it is to gain more believers and to adapt these believers into a political system, and that's where it separates from Christianity. And so it is politically imperialistic, and we have to think of the religion as not being separate from the political construct. They are one and the same. And Muslims themselves will agree, saying that, yes, Islam is about the whole thing. It's not just about private belief. This is a big problem in Sweden. I've spoken to some Swedish people about this. They think of Islam in a very Lutheran way, since Sweden itself is Lutheran. and they think of religion as being your own personal discussions with God, what you believe privately, and so on. That has nothing to do with Islam. There is that aspect as well, of course, but there's so much more. And Islam is political in the sense that Christianity, and certainly Lutheranism, is not at all. And so this is why Islam cannot be tolerated, again, only to very small degrees in Western countries, because the goal is precisely to turn Sweden and other European countries, and ultimately the whole world, into an Islamic caliphate. That is this clearly stated goal. And again, when I came out with this lengthy article a couple of years ago on the subject, most of the critique that I received was actually not from Muslims, as one might have thought, but from leftists who say, well, how dare you speak of Islam this way? Whereas I actually even got some feedback, not to say that every Muslim who read it, liked what I wrote, but I actually got some messages from Muslim people saying that, finally somebody who gets it, like what it's all about. This is what it's about. And this is why far more radical policies than what has been discussed so far is necessary. As I also wrote, some of what I say right now seems a bit radical. 10 or 20 years from now, none of it is going to seem radical, because again, we talked about how the Germans aren't quite there yet. Europeans will continue to get closer and closer to that point, and what we're saying right now will appear to more and more people less and less radical, because they will see the direction in which things are clearly moving. So we have to be patient.
But the young Germans had a summer hit song called Ausländer raus.
Yes, I heard that one. Yeah.
Based on the Gigi D'Agostino old Italian disco song.
Oh, okay. Oh, I wasn't familiar with the older song. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, it was maybe a little bit. I think when they were singing Ausländer raus, I think maybe they should have been a bit more specific in which foreigners they're talking about. Although maybe that would have made for a less catchy song. So I guess and then there were, it's easy to sit, as a philosopher and criticize these things because they're vulgar or kind of uncouth and not specific enough. And so I wasn't crazy about the song, especially I lived as a foreigner in Germany myself for 5 years. But this is how cultural shifts happen. I mean, we talked before about how it's become cool to be conservative among young people in the United States. And as unpleasant or tasteless as a song like that might seem, it is part of how cultural shifts happen. And if young people are beginning to have the attitude, regardless of the song, of the specific song, that, well, German culture, not every aspect of it, obviously, certainly not every aspect of German history, but that German culture, by and large, is something worth defending, well, then that is something that is slowly going to help the Germans get to that point.
I tried to get through the AfD party program. Sorry.
Yeah.
Some things make you sort of happy because it seems, at least at first, as a freedom document, but then suddenly they get to universal basic income. Yeah. And my soul retreats.
Yeah, and they tend to be a bit pro-Russian as well, some of them.
Yes, and there is quite a lot on families, children, culture, language, and identity. And herein lies, I think, the problem with a lot of European states. Germany at least has a constitution. Sweden doesn't really have a constitution.
Right. Yeah. So you do have the Grundlagen, but
yes, you have to look at European countries are, you could say, more organically grown than the United States.
Sure. Yeah. Certainly.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. No, I agree. Yeah.
And most of them, up until fairly recently, were way more homogenous than they are now, conformist, and built on, I wouldn't call it values, but maybe different values than America. You have the Constitution, it's a clear document that states your values. In Sweden, for instance, there's so much that is not written down that you just pick up by being born here. And even if you immigrate and study and really engross yourself in Swedish culture, there still might be thousands of little cultural cues you miss.
Mm-hmm. And so you're saying that's a disadvantage for Sweden. You're saying because it makes these sort of conformist cultural ways.
What I'm saying is there's a tendency, I think, to bunch all the West together and say, well, what's happening in America will have consequences here in Europe. Yes, it will. But I think, most Europeans still don't understand American conservatism. Traditional American conservatism still believes in liberty as a foundational value. I would say Europeans believe in safety as a foundational value, that the government takes care of its citizens. That is what Europeans want most from their government. And in essence, I think at least American conservatism, what they want from their government is leave me the hell alone, liberty.
Yeah,
so
it's funny you mention that.
It's two different approaches to the state.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's funny you should raise it. I just wrote about an article about this a couple of weeks ago, which is well, it wasn't only about this, but about the difference between this European and American conservatism. In a certain sense, European conservatism, there are different European conservatisms, but by and large, European conservatism, in a certain sense, is more conservative, potentially. It has become less so, of course, but potentially more so because it has this faith in the king, whereas American conservatism was founded, America in general was founded on rebellion against the king. So this whole sentiment of, for king and country doesn't have any purchase in the United States. And and we have liberalism or libertarianism, one might perhaps say, but I would even say liberalism built into the Declaration of Independence from the very beginning. So American conservatives are a bit more liberal in this sense, in the American sense. Actually, I guess I would say in the European sense, in terms of freedom of speech and leave me alone, as you say, more so than Europeans have. And this does lead to a certain rugged independence, if you will, which is a kind of an American trait still. One doesn't.
Hoover, isn't it?
Hoover, what, the rugged independence?
Yes.
Did he use that phrase?
Herbert Hoover, rugged.
You could be right.
Rugged individualism, I think he said.
Oh, rugged individualism, yeah. Yeah, it could be, yeah. And that is very American. And as you say, European conservatism is much more tied to the state. One sees this as far back as, I was about to say Thomas Hobbes. Before him too, actually, Selden even, but maybe most famously in Hobbes. And that is something that, I think you make a good point, that makes it harder in a certain sense for people to take this sort of more radical type of initiative that is going to be required in order to secure Europe's future. And so that's something that European conservatives certainly are going to have to struggle against, and they're going to have to find alternative sources of power, really, because yes, they do need to win elections. But there has to be this understanding, and the Germans have a very hard time with this, especially the Germans, because, the Germans are still Hegelians deep down, and who worship the state. And the state surely can't be wrong. Even if they disagree with particular policies, ultimately the state is right. And you find this among German conservatives a lot as well.
I think that's collectivism. That's the problem, isn't it?
Right.
Because the European conservatives are also collectivists. They're not individualists.
Right. Yeah,
our Swedish Democrats, they call themselves, most of them that I've spoken to at least, call themselves social conservatives, which means they want to be the social democrats from the 50s.
Yeah, right. Yes, exactly. And that's my big problem with many of the so-called, quote-unquote, far-right parties in Europe, is that many of them actually are fairly socialistic. I think you interviewed Jimmie Åkesson a while ago, right? I think I did. Yeah, I listened to it.
I like him. I do. I really do. I think he means well. But naturally, I don't agree with him on some basic things, because I think Sweden has gone way too far, and there's no resistance here that I can see that would be able to solve this problem, which means you have to accept facts on the ground. So facts on the grounds are that we have big groups of people that sooner or later will start fighting over each other for resources, because we pool all our resources, or a lot of them at least, in Sweden,
via the state, right? So, one of the easiest ways to alleviate what I see as a coming real problem would be to let people keep more of their money. That is, give them more liberty. Give them more economic liberty, give them more cultural liberty, give us a constitution, give us a strong justice system that is independent from the polity. But this is not going to happen either, because, I mean, if the Swedish Democrats might lack a time machine, the cultural soil for growing ideas of liberty and individualism, I don't see them here.
No,
I really looked.
Yeah, I remember you taking Jimmy Åkesson to task for this actually during the interview, which I appreciated. You basically, what you're saying is, that they would have to turn Sweden into America, basically. And yeah, as you say, I don't think that's going to happen.
But I think this would actually maybe work better if we take away all subsidies. A lot of people would leave this place because it's cold and dark here.
Right.
And depressing, and we're no fun. So why would you stay if the state doesn't hand out free money?
Right.
You know?
Yeah. Well,
and it's not free money, but it's free for some.
Yeah, it's free for them, certainly. Yeah, exactly. That would certainly help, I'm sure. I mean, you can't have open borders and socialism at the same time. Certainly, you shouldn't have socialism, period, but certainly not with open borders. But I think probably a more realistic approach is to tackle these problems from within a more European, or in this case, Swedish cultural framework. Now, that might sound like a fool's errand, but I think that's still probably more realistic in the sense that if there is a cultural shift, because, I mean, I notice that, again, you know this better than I do, but I notice that even Swedish, as you say, even Swedish conservatives or so-called conservatives from an American point of view, they're still quite proud of their socialist state.
Yes,
and they're proud of their healthcare and so on, and of free schooling, etc., and of parental leave for fathers, etc. They're all very proud of it, and you find people across the Swedish spectrum who are all proud of it, and so that goes culturally so deep that I think that the way to for Sweden to dig themselves, for Swedish people to dig themselves out of this problem is to work with that cultural framework, from within that cultural framework, it seems to me. And to understand that, okay, these things are going to break down if we allow this continued immigration, and if we don't have repatriation. Again, like the Germans, the Swedes aren't there yet. But there has to be an understanding that what we treasure in Sweden, which is the collectivism and so on, little point, I think, in trying to tear all of that down, even though people like you and me would like to see that happen. But rather, what we treasure, these things that we do treasure, they will not survive continued Islamic immigration. And once there is a cultural shift in that direction, maybe then Swedish people would find their solution.
Yeah, and we just had our own little Rotherham grooming gang scandal here in Sweden. Well, yes, concerning elder care. It has gotten out now that a lot of elders have been getting raped by their immigrant caretakers.
I must have missed that story. Okay.
Yeah, well, we didn't advertise it in English.
Right, I suppose not. Yeah, understandably enough. I see.
So, yeah, and public service here didn't really... I don't think they covered it. Maybe they did. Maybe they touched on it. Or...
newspapers. Yeah, I do look into Swedish newspapers every now and then, just to, partly to keep my Swedish going and partly just out of curiosity to see what's going on. But yeah, as you say, I guess a lot of the major Swedish news sources wouldn't be dealing with it or wouldn't be advertising it a lot.
Well, as a representative of the Anglo-Saxon world, or at least the only representative I have in front of me at the moment, I have to shame you some that you aren't more interested in Sweden. And I'm not saying that your Democrats in the United States should just, we should be more like Sweden or use us as an example without actually looking into us. But you should look at Sweden, because Sweden is interesting. It stayed out of 2 world wars, so it got to uninterruptedly put in place this welfare state system with socialist sort of attributes that now plagues all of the West. So I think Sweden is actually ahead of the curve with our explosions and our child soldiers in the street and our elderly getting raped by immigrants. I think we're ahead of the curve. And I think there are things you could learn from us. Yeah, no, but you're so self-absorbed.
Yeah, no, absolutely, it's true. And this is when people say, people say Americans are more self-hating and more orcophobic and so on than Swedes are, and I said no, it's not true. It's just that over there, everybody has already in Sweden, everybody agrees on the orcophobia. Whereas here there is still a fight about it, which is why we seem to be more extremist over here, more extreme in our self-hate over here. But that's because we're fighting out this moment now, this battle, this fight that was already settled in Sweden and other Western countries a long time ago. So yeah, you're absolutely right. And
we had the burn the flag debate in Sweden in, I think, late 60s, early 70s.
Right.
There was a painting and it was taken by police. And then after that, everyone decided, yeah, of course you can burn the flag.
Right. Yeah, it became bigger here. Well, I mean, there were some people burning the flag, of course, during Vietnam War and everything. But yeah, it became a political debate like in the 90s. Remember even Hillary Clinton wading into it at the time. And this is also something as the philosophy of history being a big one of my areas of expertise, that basically you are, as you say, you are at a more advanced, quote unquote, advanced or progressed historical stage in Sweden than we are here in the United States, which is obviously not to say that we're just going to repeat everything that's happening in Sweden, but it's true that yes, if we want to know more about our own future and learn some lessons about what to embrace and about what to avoid, we should be looking to places like Sweden, absolutely, and the United Kingdom and France and so on. But yeah, Sweden is, which is interesting because Sweden also has often prided itself, as you know, on being quite avant-garde and
the most progressive. That's what we call. We call ourselves föregångslandet. That literally means progressive country.
Right, exactly. And the first feminist government in the world and so on.
Moral superpower. We used to be a humanitarian great power, right, but then we amassed so much morals that we became a moral superpower.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so there is this sort of progressive arrogance, and this is you can see, like, for example, if you take France also typically prides itself on its progressivism, on being the first in doing something, but there is also a strong conservative element in France traditionally. People always say, oh, well, there's nothing more French than to be new and innovative and groundbreaking and so on. But the conservative reaction to that is also very French, whereas that's not so much the case in Sweden. In Sweden, as a Swedish colleague, Johan Gärdebo, told me, as when he was talking about the Swedish psyche to me, he was saying that basically in Sweden, there's only one thought at a time, which I thought was a good way of putting it. Basically that, yes, things do change and things move along, but there's basically just one thing at a time, and there isn't that constant interplay of a struggle between the conservatives and the progressives, as we see in places like the United States, to some degree in France as well. And that, of course, makes it much harder for anything to change in a positive direction in Sweden.
I think so. The Swedish welfare state, as all of the Scandinavian welfare states, hinged a lot upon homogeneity. That everything was so homogeneous, ethnically, culturally, in every possible way. I mean, Swedes voted for the same. I mean, the Social Democrats in the 40s had like 53% of the vote.
Yeah, right, exactly.
We were voluntarily a one-party state, basically, for 70 years or something.
I remember the first time I was a child living in Sweden when they lost an election for the first time. And I still remember, I mean, I was very young, but I still remember people talking about that. And it was the time
shock.
Yeah, exactly. It was the time of krisen, as they were calling it, the crisis, and where the socialists suddenly lost. Just around the time that we moved, actually. So not that it was related one to the other, but it was maybe if one had to move, one should have moved before and not when the socialists were just finally losing. But yeah. We were supposed to be more optimistic, I think, in this
Yes.
in this podcast
to tie it all together.
Right, exactly. But at least by identifying the actual problems, and that, of course, is a way of finding hopefully a solution and of being more optimistic. And again, as I said earlier, of understanding that, well, Swedish people has a certain framework, and we can't wish everything away. We don't live in a fantasy land. But if one accepts that framework to some degree, one can still see what's possible within that framework, and try to find a constructive solution.
I'm not sure, because when I watch, like, the British alternative YouTube dissident scene, I look at their conversations from time to time, and I notice whenever one of them has been to the States on a lecture tour or whatever, they come back with this idea of liberty being foundational to the West, and that they don't have it themselves.
Right.
And I think a lot of Europeans feel that maybe after the Second World War, where we definitely prioritized safety before liberty, maybe it's time to grow up, because America has been taking care of us.
Yeah.
We've been under your nuclear umbrella.
Yeah.
And it has given us a sense of false safety, and it has incapacitated us. We haven't spent any money on our armies, so we haven't gotten men, nor a male part of the public sector, which you need to win elections.
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe it's not our own cultural context we should be looking to. Maybe it is liberty.
Right. Well, I mean,
we've tried this now.
Yeah.
And you can, I mean, as I say to people who oppose immigration here in Sweden, but the immigrants didn't invite themselves. So there was something in your culture that made you want to commit civilizational suicide. And what is that? And why? And why can't we talk about that? Because if we just get rid of one of the symptoms now, your ideology or whatever it is that drives you to this point will just lead you here again by other means.
There are mutually contradicting segments of the culture. Yeah, no, so I entirely agree with you. One has to be a bit discriminating in terms of what aspects of the culture need reform and which aspects either do not need reform or cannot be reformed. And the whole idea of recapturing a sense of liberty and so on. Yeah, I mean, one has to understand that this idea of multiculturalism and so which has become a part of the culture is contradictory, is mutually exclusive with the aspect of Swedish collectivism and the welfare state. And that once one realizes that these aspects of Swedish culture are mutually exclusive, then that would perhaps, one may hope, be a way for Swedish people to understand that, okay, if they want to save the one, they have to get rid of the other.
I have no hope for Sweden, really. I just brought it up because we were talking about Europe in general. But, I mean, at least we got, some optimism in Poland, apparently.
Right, exactly. And the United States. But, it's... I'm not saying I mean, you know me well enough, I think, to know that I'm not an optimist, generally speaking.
No.
Yeah, but
I've read your work.
Right, exactly. But one can at least say that, okay, there are the accusation against somebody like me is always that one is a doomsday prophet or something like that, and it's certainly not certainly not the case. These things are a lot more complex than just saying that it's all bad or it's all good, and we see that now. I mean, in a certain conservative resurgence, to tie back to what we were talking about in the beginning, one sees that there is hope, and one sees that human beings do control their destinies, and to say that something is unlikely to happen doesn't mean that it's impossible. Just to say that there are these possible solutions and that there is reason for optimism is not the same as saying that one thinks it will happen. So I would be inclined in your direction as well, and saying that, I think that a number of European countries have passed the point of no return, or that they have gotten to the point that a solution cannot be found without actual violence, which is a very sad thing to say. But I mean, if I look at France, for example, France could not, I don't think France, for example, could pull back without actual violence at this point, because that's how far.
Neither could Belgium.
Right, exactly. Belgium
or
is...
Sweden. And that's what I'm saying. There's just...
Belgium, I remember last time, I walked down the streets of Brussels. I mean, it's not a European city. It's just not. I even remember being in the subway, in the metro in Belgium, in Brussels, and somebody had written on the wall, "Ici jadis vivaient des Belges." Like here, once upon a time, Belgians used to live, which I thought was quite apt, quite accurate. And this is how it is. So nobody. But
it was written in French, so no one there could read it except you. So
exactly. Although supposedly some of them came from the former French colonies, so maybe they had. Yeah. So maybe they had. Yeah. Right. Exactly. So a little bit of French Gallicism in them, but yeah, nobody wants violence. I certainly do not want violence by any means. But it's simply a realistic observation of the current state of affairs that some of these problems, if they are solved at all, which is questionable, if they are, it will be at least in part through violence, which is very sad. But I think that's how it is.
Yes, so do I. So that's not really ending on a note of optimism, but,
right.
but very us.
Yes, right. It is very us indeed. Yeah.
Thank you once again for being a guest on Deconstructive Criticism.
Thank you so much for having me. Always a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Deconstructive Criticism. This episode's guest was Dr. Benedict Beckeld. You can find him on X, and his work on oikophobia is online. Please support Deconstructive Criticism on Patreon, medlem.io, or Swish 0768 943737 0768 943737. I am Aaron Flam. Until next, have a good unit of time.